Welcome to Books in Five, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author 5 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written a fantastic new book about the need for public leaders to think long term when they are in government. Nicholas, thank you so much for being our guest on Books in Five. Please introduce yourself, the title of your book, and where you are joining us from today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'm Nick Chesterley. I'm joining from Ottawa. I am the author of Future Generation Government, How to Legislate for the Long Term. And I've both did a PhD in economics, that might come up more, behavioral economics in particular, and am now have held a number of roles in government.
Great. Let's begin with our first question. The book highlights the ways that governments frequently make decisions that benefit the present at the future's expense. Tell us more about your motivation to explore this topic and the perspectives that you drew from.
So I'll weave together a few different topics on this one, I think. And I would say one, and it's a story that has really struck with me from writing the book, is that President Roosevelt did fireside chats 100 years ago about for Great Depression, World War II. They were radio addresses that were seen as instrumental as bringing the U.S. together and sort of uniting the country in a very difficult time for the U.S. And he did about 30 of them over his career. And he was asked at one point, well, why didn't you do more of these? And his answer was, well, I spent 4 or 5 days of uninterrupted time to prepare for each one of these. And I just don't have time. I have too much other work to do to prepare for doing more of them. And what has stuck with me about that is that I don't know about you, and I don't know about the listeners, but I almost never have 4 or 5 days on time to spend on a single task. And I'm not the leader of a major power. Like I expect the prime minister or the president or anyone does not have like a week to spend on preparing for individual speeches these days of any country. And so I come from a behavioral scientist background. My PhDs in behavioral economics, thinking about how do you help individuals plan for the long term. And having since worked in government, it seemed to me maybe there are lessons from that individual behavioral science perspective that we can draw on and learn from to help improve how governments and how leaders think about the future. How can we nudge governments, nudge leaders to think more about the future? And so that was sort of the macro motivation for it and got me thinking about it overall. I then did not make very much progress writing this book, which is in itself a long-term project. Anyway, if you've tried writing books, I mean, mixed reviews is somewhat of a challenging task, so I had fun as well at various points. But the pandemic struck, which was itself an example and an interesting example of long-term preparedness and how do we be prepared for long-term challenges. And I also had kids, which is a helpful reminder for me as well about like the world my kids will grow up in. And so I think that both gave me more time because I was stuck at home in lockdowns anyway, and so had time to write, but really helped sort of focus and narrow my emphasis a little more in terms of thinking through, well, how do we really bring the future more into policy conversations and carve out space and time and attention and focus to prioritize it? And I've lost track of time, so you can steer me on that.
You know what? We're about halfway through, so I'll give you a little bit more time, maybe about 2 minutes to talk about behavioral science, because you mentioned that earlier. Can you give us a description and tell us more what that entails?
Yeah. And so there's a lot of different fields that would say they contribute to behavioral science, psychology being an obvious one. I come from an economics background. And so from our perspective, or from the behavioral economics perspective, it's about like, well, what is the psychology of how people make decisions? There is, it's a little unfair to my economic colleagues, but there's a stereotype of the economist who believes that people always make rational decisions and decide things perfectly. And much of the origins of behavioral economics was, well, that's obviously not true when you interact with people. People make mistakes. People have biases. People are more likely to do some things than others. Can we come up with a slightly more richer, more thoughtful model of human behavior? And does that lead to interesting conclusions or analysis on economic behavior? This is somewhat irrelevant, but like the abstract model of perfect behavior is actually quite interesting in terms of predicting behavior in some ways, even though I think almost all economists would agree that like it's not that they think it's correct, it's just that it's useful. But so behavioral science looked at things like, well, people are present biased. They focus too much on the present and not on the future. And so that's the bias I look at most in this context. But also things like salience bias, that we pay attention to things that are right in front of us and forget about things that are less visible. And so there's research, for example, that people spend too much time focusing on natural disasters that lead to a lot of human impacts, and that's in the headlines, even though there are sort of slower moving ones that have greater human impacts that don't make the headline because they don't happen all at once. So you can think of a sudden flash floods get a lot of headlines, long-term wearing away of riverbanks, though may actually be worse in the long term, doesn't get the same headline because there's no single impact. And so salience matters, people's attention matters and what they pay attention to, biases, mood, how we are feeling on a given day, all of these things can affect our decision making, and they affect individual decisions in a different way. They can affect government decisions. I will say there are clear differences between how like an organization makes decisions and an individual. And so, though I think there's lessons and inspiration to be drawn, I don't want to overdraw the comparison either. You can't copy paste skills and successful practices for individuals into government, but you can learn a lot. And I think one particular area of interest that we may talk about again is that saving for retirement is a big issue for individuals. Many of us are really bad at it. And there's various economic strategies for nudging people to save better for retirement, encouraging them to do so, that make a huge difference, a remarkable difference in a way that like paying people to save for retirement is not that effective. Having them opt in or opt out and making it the default really is effective. And so I hope there's lots to be learned from that.
Yeah, let's move on to our second question. The first section of your book reveals humanity's bias towards short-termism. Can you walk us through the difficulties that individuals and governments face when trying to balance their decisions?
I'm already spoiling my second answer here. I'd forgotten that was the next question. So short-term bias. When we think of the individual perspective, there is a very clear bias for individuals to think about now and not about later. And that can be everything from it's hard to stick to a diet because we're tempted to eat chocolate now, even though later we might regret it, to saving for retirement, to going to the gym, to sort of bigger picture, like doing our taxes, where the incentive is to delay it rather than do it immediately and sort of leave it to the next self. And one of the models that I think is helpful in thinking about this for individuals is the model of multiple selves, where you can think of your current self as making decisions and effectively delegating unpleasantness to the future self as a sort of alternative employee of your personal business, if you will. And so the current self wants to get all the fun stuff. They want to watch fun movies. They want to eat great snacks. They want to sleep in. They want to do whatever. It is your future self who then has to deal with the consequences of those decisions. And so you get this sort of ongoing pattern of present bias in individuals, where they make decisions today that maximize their enjoyment, but long term they regret those decisions or they feel they wish they hadn't done them. And so there's a huge body of work on this. We could spend a full hour talking, we spend days talking about this. But it's an interesting area of study. There's lots of nuance and complexity, but that's for the individual side. Thinking more on the government, I would say many of the pressures are similar in that we face a remarkably busy world today. And the example I like is that if you were a policymaker when the printing press was introduced, you could have spent probably 50 years thinking about, well, what are the policy implications of the printing press? And should we pass laws? And you had a lot of time to think about this and do analysis. AI today, policymakers are not spending 50 years thinking about the implications of AI. They don't have 50 days to think about the implications of AI. Like this stuff changes so quickly. And so one big pressure on individuals and governments is just the vast amount of information that pours in all the time. And that leads us to sort of over-focus on now just because we're overwhelmed with the present. And I should say, look, like governments focus on the present for important reasons. There are important short-term issues that need solving. And so it's not that governments are wrong to focus on the short term. It's that, in my view, they're a little too biased to do it more than they should. So it's a bias, but it isn't a like they should never focus on the short term. Sometimes we will do short term decisions, and that's probably right because there are short term crises that face us. But that's one big pressure on governments. A second is that because individuals are themselves present biased, voters can act in a present biased way, and so they may reward governments that also provide short term gains, even if there are long term consequences. And so if that's how voters behave, governments will react in turn. And so there's this incentive, even if political leaders or officials wish they could be more long-termist, they want to like provide what voters want. And if voters want short-term benefits, then they'll focus on the short term as well. And so there's that pressure. And then a third challenging one, which doesn't quite so much have an individual parallel, is elections. In democratic countries, you have elections. If you lose an election, it really doesn't matter what the impact of your policies are. And so, of course, there's an incentive to focus on what can we get done to make sure we win the next election, even if it creates problems for our future self who wins the next election. So all of those can sort of create pressure for leaders to focus on the future. And a couple of thoughts out of that, I would say. One is that by the time I finished the book, I was thinking a lot more about trust and leadership than when I started the book. And I think trust is a really important factor in this, because if voters don't trust leaders to deliver on the future, then you can really get into an unfortunate cycle where voters don't bother lobbying or voting for long-term things, so they don't trust leaders anyway. And so leaders don't bother delivering it. That can be corrosive on trust as well. And you get worse and worse. And you can really reach an unfortunate equilibrium. And there's this great study, which I think is a really nice illustration of this, about the introduction of pensions, which are a long-term policy, because you're asking people to short-term pay for pensions, long-term they get money back. And it was introduced by Bismarck, who various views about Bismarck, but was totally uncontested in elections. He was going to win anyway, but he was worried in 20 years he might lose. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going quickly. But so in 20 years, he's like, I might lose elections. Let's introduce pensions now. So he did. People were unhappy, but in 20 years, he was still popular, hopefully. Fine. But then the UK thought they would introduce pensions. And in the UK's case, it was the public service who tried to stop it because they didn't trust that politicians wouldn't use the money that had been saved up for other purposes. And so there was this like tricky dynamic where the public service, which I think often likes to see itself as a long-term institution, was actually advocating the short-term policy because of this lack of. And so lots more could be said. Fascinating dynamics. I think I'm out of time. Let's keep going.
Yeah, let's move on to our third question. Reforming the way that policymakers operate makes up the next part of your book. How does what gets measured and making the future tangible help to orient governments towards better decisions?
Great. So we're getting into like the how do we do better part of it. And so the two separate strategies we can think about, but they're linked, as your question suggests. One is that we don't always do a great job measuring our impact on the future. And if we don't measure the impact, we A, might not know what our impact is, and B, even if we do have a sense, it's not very salient. What measures matters. And so when we're measuring something and the measure is visible and salient, that can change how we make decisions. And there's a lot of behavioral science research on that as well. And so one obvious area for potential improvement is that we tend to use gross domestic product, GDP, as a measure of success for economic policies. And there are lots of criticisms of GDP. Many of them are really thoughtful. There's lots of reasons why it's limited, though it has its strength as well. And it came out of the Great Depression and World War II when how many tanks you were producing really mattered. So there are reasons for the way it is, and we can have a longer conversation about that. But from a long-term perspective, its key issue is that GDP is a measure of annual income. It's a measure of your salary per year, to put it in individual terms. But it doesn't measure how much you have in your bank account. It's not a measure of wealth. It's not a measure of sort of how rich you are or how much you'll have in retirement. And so inherently, it creates an incentive for governments to try to increase their annual income, but not necessarily to save for the long term. And that can distort behavior because in many situations, both for individuals and governments, there is an option to draw down your accounts in order to boost up your short-term income. And that's great for the today and bad for tomorrow, effectively. And so one key strategy is to come up with some sort of national measure gross domestic wealth, not just GDP, but GDW, to better understand what is our wealth made up of. And I will say, I mean, it's an interestingly challenging measurement because wealth isn't just how many roads do we have or how many factories do we have. The health of the population matters for wealth. The quality of our institutions and the rule of law matters for wealth. The natural environment and having wetlands and flourishing ecosystems all matters for wealth. So it's potentially a very expansive measure. There is some really interesting work going on with the OECD, with other organizations trying to measure that. And so the technical challenges are getting there, but spending more time focusing on how does this affect our wealth and less on does this increase our annual income would be a good step in the right direction. So that's one. The second is to change how we make decisions and to make the future a little more salient in our decisions. And the example I like best of this is that Jeff Bezos, head of Amazon, famously when he does a round table or has a meeting, likes to leave one chair empty. And the reason he does it is because when he does the round table and he says, well, what do you think? What do you think? He gets the empty chair and he says, well, what does the customer think? The empty chair represents the customer. And the idea is that way you never forget the customer's perspective. And at a very simple level, that's what I think we want to do in our decision making with the future, because the future is not there. We can't have future people come to our meetings. They're not born yet. And so it's harder to bring them to life and make them real in our decision making. They're not going to lobby governments. There's no association of the unborn. Like, it gets into complicated territory. So making it salient in our decision making is the other one. That empty chair model is the intuition, but things like red teams, which exist to sort of challenge proposals, can be set up to argue for future oriented impacts. Foresight exercises, not necessarily to predict the future, but to think about what are the possible models of the future, and is what we're proposing suitable for those different models, is really important. Diversity on teams has been shown to increase future thinking and to make it more easy, because having more perspectives encourages teams to think more deeply about the long-term impacts of their proposals. So there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different things we can do in this area. But I think at the heart of it, it is about first making things more salient, measuring it better, and then second, bringing that into how we make decisions and how society makes decisions. And as a brief tangent, I will say there's some fascinating research on mini publics, which are sort of like oversized juries to make public policy decisions with a random draw of citizens, whether Canadians or elsewhere, to make them. Interesting model, lots to be said about it, but there is some research that they can be very good at thinking about the future if they're prompted properly. If they're not, it's not so good, but you can design them in a way to encourage future-oriented thinking, which can be very powerful. And so thinking about that kind of innovation too can be very effective.
Let's move on to our fourth question. Two further solutions that you write about include binding public leaders to their promises and giving space for iteration and experimentation. What do these important strategies offer for better long-term results?
I'm really pleased that you bundled these two together because they are in tension. Like, you can't do both at the same time very easily, which I think I agree with both of them. Like, they're both worth thinking about, but obviously some will, like, one will apply in some scenarios, one another. You'll need to be thoughtful about using them. There's no cookie cutter answer. But to talk about each in turn. So one thing you can do as an individual when you want to commit to sort of future-oriented thinking is to make commitments. You impose a cost of some kind, whether it's money or time or your reputation or whatever, that if you change your mind and start indulging in chocolate or what have you, then you will pay that price. And so it discourages you from doing so and imposes a short-term cost. My favorite example of this, though, is a bit out of date because credit cards are less and less a thing these days, is that at one point there was this movement of freezing your credit card in ice. Because if you wanted to go shopping, you'd have to thaw the credit card out. And if you microwaved it, to destroy the strip. And so you'd have a cooling off period, if you will, but it's a warming up period, like a 3 hour or whatever it would take to melt the ice, wait before you could go shopping. And so it imposed a short-term delay, a short-term cost before you could go shopping. And so discouraged you from people who were worried they were shopping too much, discouraged. Now you could enter your card information in the internet, and anyway, it's no longer successful, sadly. But that's the intuition. You can make soft commitments or hard commitments, like binding commitments. You could, I don't know, throw away all the sweets in your house, and so you have to literally go out to get it. Soft commitments, you tell your friends you're not going to eat sweets, but you still have the option to do so, kind of thing. So they vary. But so in a government context, you can think of campaign promises and promises more generally as commitments, and they are somewhat binding. There's research that governments often do fulfill their campaign promises. But the more interesting model, which doesn't really have an individual comparison, is setting up institutions, delegating power to institutions to carry out long-term goals. The lots of possible examples in this space. Central banks are kind of an example of this, though not necessarily intentionally, but they've been given a long-term goal, maintain inflation at a set rate, and then they've been delegated the power to do so. Other examples you could think about, though, are things like Norway, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is intentionally set up for long-term thinking and for saving resources for future generations. And so a percentage of the money that comes in through natural resource wealth from Norway, and it is a lot, goes into this fund that allows them to save for future generations. A very different model, but also intended for long-term thinking, is Finland, and they have a committee for the future in parliament that works closely with their government to think about the impact on the future of Finnish government decisions. And it's sort of part of a broader ecosystem of future thinking institutions within the Prime Minister's office, within the individual departments, within civil society. I'm taking too much time on this answer, but I will say one of the most interesting things I find about that example in Finland, and it's one of the most successful examples, I think, in the world, is yes, they do interesting work and have important results, but some of the research is one of the biggest impacts they have is that a lot of senior politicians and leaders, when they were young, served on this committee for the future, and it helps shape their thinking and inform their thinking about the future. And so you have a really long-term effect from the practice, in fact. The other one is experimentation. And so the problem with commitments is that we don't know what the future is going to be. And particularly in the modern world where things change so quickly, over planning, over committing can be dangerous as well and can have costs as well. And so something I think governments are not always good at is taking a very sort of iterative experimental approach to things, saying, look, we don't know the answer. We're going to try a bunch of things. Most of them will fail, but we'll figure out what works and we'll do more of that. And I do think that's got to be part of the solution for any institution and any government to be better at long-term thinking, because so many of the problems we face, whether it's climate change or infrastructure maintenance or antibiotic resistance or demographic change or technological disruption, we don't know what the answers are necessarily. We're going to have to try different things and see what works. And we're terrible at predicting the future. And so taking a more iterative approach can create more space to do that. And though a very different context and not a democracy, so strong caveats to this comparison, I think China has some interesting examples of that, who've been very intentional about taking an experimental approach to public policy and creating areas and regions and zones where they can try new policies and either scale them up or scale them down as makes sense. But dictatorships are not the same as democracy. There's my caveat.
Let's finish with our fifth question. Your book concludes with case studies that explore some of the wickedest problems humanity faces. Using your framework, how can our institutions better deal with climate change and infrastructure?
Before I answer that, I'm going to say one more thing about my last answer, just to break your system. I apologize. Which is that I think sometimes people will think about the long term and think about the pressure of elections and leadership and that kind of thing, and think, well, the problem is democracy. Dictatorships must be so much better at this. And for what it's worth, that's not correct. There's different schools of thought on this, and you're getting my perspective, but I think it's wrong. And I think the research backs it up as well. That on average, dictatorships are very bad at planning for the long term. They do worse in economic growth. They do worse in climate change. They do worse in all sorts of long-term problems. But the more fundamental issue I would also worry about is that, yes, you may have an individual dictator who cares about the future and plans for it and uses the centralization of power to sort of mobilize a country towards the future. But for every philosopher king, you can have a vagabond prince. And the problem of succession is very salient. And when we're thinking long-term, we need to think of solutions that are viable for the long term. I, for one, I think democracy can do better than it can, but I wouldn't want the takeaway to be dictatorships can do better, because I don't think they can. I think democracies do pretty well here. They could just do even better than they do. That aside, thinking about climate change and infrastructure, and I've already wasted some of my time on another thing. Look, these are both hard problems, and they're hard for a lot of reasons. And so I don't want to say that nudging our governments and leaders to think a little more of the future will solve these, because there's a lot of complexity around both of these. But big picture, they share a number of things, which is that decisions today will have long-term impacts, whether that's saving climate change or the type and quality of institutions we build, and even more so maintain. Because in infrastructure, the challenge really is that there's incentive to build infrastructure, but not to maintain it. And so we see low-quality roads and bridges and all these things, schools across countries and around the world. And there's these estimates of the infrastructure maintenance debt, which are in the trillions of dollars worldwide from various associations. And so how do we nudge our governments to think a bit more long-term about both of those? And I think all of the strategies apply. And I'll go through them quickly because we already talked about the strategies earlier in questions. But measuring, obviously, big implication. Are we measuring success of our climate change activity and the resilience of our institutions to climate change, flood protection, this kind of thing? If we expect the climate to change, do we have a sense of sort of our national resilience to those changes? And can we do better measuring it? Infrastructure, even more obviously, it's not enough to just count new buildings you build. You want to count the quality of the buildings you got and the quality of the bridges you got. And so having a measure of national wealth should certainly include a measure of the sort of how well maintained national infrastructure is. Folding into decisions, I think in some ways it is the most sort of intuitive. We should make institutions more visible. We should make infrastructure more visible, climate change more visible in our decisions. There's lots we can do there. On commitments, what I think is interesting is that we see this already in climate change in many regards. You'll see commissioners for climate change, for example, or sustainability commissioners, other things in various countries, who are, in many ways, institutions set up to think about a long-term problem. I think it will be interesting to see how those evolve. I don't know that we want an individual commissioner for every long-term problem. I think that probably will lead to chaos to some extent. But I sort of hope that it evolves into a broader like mandate and responsibility for long-term thinking. And we see that with the commissioner for sustainability in Wales, with various other institutions and commissioners set up in other countries as well. That sort of, I think, partly were motivated by climate change, but have a broader mandate as well to think about the impact and sustainability of future generations. So more things to do there as well. Experimentation, I think, interesting for both of them in different ways. Climate change, important because I don't know that we have the correct solution for climate change, and technology continues to evolve and the world continues to evolve. And so taking an iterative approach is going to be important there as well. Infrastructure, I think, is superficially not necessarily welcoming to iteration. No one wants to build half a bridge or half a hospital and see how it works. That seems bad. That said, I think more could be done than we currently test models. You can use digital technology, and there is a whole, and I'm running out of time, agile approach to infrastructure that allows for a more iterative approach. And so not possible everywhere. And I guess that would be my bottom line overall, is that we're not going to do these kind of things everywhere. There are important short-term pressures. There's projects that don't make sense, but we can do a lot more than we do and do better than we do.
Nicholas, that has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Let's move on to our bonus questions. Nick, tell us more about your career path. What interested you in studying decision science?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer for you, other than that I really like economics. And I think for me, it is very compelling to think about how do people make these decisions in economics. I mean, in so much of our lives are affected by economic decision making, the question of like wealth and allocation of wealth and like buying things. And so I think I wanted to better understand that. And I think we could do much better than we do. And that's true for governments as it happens, but I got to later in my career. But even at the individual level, it has remarkable to me how, and I hesitate to say inefficient, but like people make a lot of decisions for a lot of different reasons. And from a pure, like, what is the optimal decision rationale or perspective, they aren't necessarily efficient. And I think it's interesting to think through why are people making those decisions? And there are often good reasons for it. Like, I'm not trying to judge people for making efficient decisions. There are reasons why they make those things, why they make decisions. But I spent a lot of my time as an academic trying to think about those things, think about realizing people are not perfect, a crooked timber of humanity, if you will. How can governments and policymakers better support them and like provide assistance to them where it makes sense?
Obviously, the book is a major achievement, but tell us more about another accomplishment that you're proud of.
I mean, I don't want to just lose the track of the book. For most of the time I was writing this book, I thought it would never be published. I have to say, like, it was a long journey, and it started as a passion project that I just sort of was interested in the topic, and I wrote most of it and was like, hey, maybe I should try to publish this. And anyway, so I'm surprised it was published at all, and the fact that you have a copy behind you and that at least one person has read it is a huge relief. So great news there. I think otherwise, big accomplishments. I mean, I was very proud of my PhD when I finished it. I had a great time doing my PhD. I have been lucky to do a lot of things I've really enjoyed. Like one can think of them as accomplishments, I suppose, but like I try to do things and pick things that I will really enjoy. And so I've enjoyed my PhD. I've enjoyed working for government, having the chance to contribute to sort of the broader service to the public the government represents. I'm very proud of my kids who are 3 and 1 and like totally crazy at the moment, but they're great kids. Like I don't know. I don't know if I have a list of accomplishments, but I've done a lot of things I was excited to do and had fun doing.
Final question for you. Do you have any projects on the horizon? Another book topic, perhaps?
Surviving my 3-year-old and 1-year-old is my most important short-term project. I do. I enjoyed writing this book. I can't remember who it was. Some writer made the point that they didn't always enjoy writing, but they enjoyed having written, and I think that's probably the case for me. The actual writing, sitting down and like thinking about text was somewhat grinding, but I enjoy engaging with ideas. I enjoy thinking about this topic and other topics, and so I would come away from writing sessions like, oh, there's lots of interesting things to think about, which I enjoyed. So certainly at some point I might think of another book. I think I've been finishing the book. I've become more interested and more thoughtful about issues of leadership and motivation than when I started, and so I wonder if there's like I'm thinking about. I'm more interested in topics around like how do we run good institutions and build good institutions and lead good institutions. But I don't know. I mean, in the short term, just keeping my kids alive is a full-time activity.
Again, the title of the book is Future Generation Government. It is very excellent. You should definitely go and read it. If you're not able to buy it, check it out from your local library. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us on Books in 5.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sudan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.